it was almost in my mind a confirmation of, well, if the Orthodox people aren't going to accept me, then I don't want to be a part of them anyways. My name is Eliana Aviva Duthie. I'm from Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and it's a military base. My father is an officer in the Navy, so I was born there and lived there until I was 18 and went to university.
Can you tell us a little bit about what life was like growing up?
Growing up, it was very privileged in the sense of I grew up with my feet in the grass, going to the beach on weekends during summers. It was very carefree in the sense of a childhood growing up in rural North Carolina. At the same time, my parents divorced when I was 7, and my father was in the military, so he moved around a lot. When I became 12, or when I got to the age of 12 years old, my mother started introducing my brother and I to a church. Growing up, we never really had a presence of God in our house. We knew obviously at Christmas time that it was celebrated for, Jesus's birth and whatnot. And Easter was like Easter baskets and chocolate and candy and getting together for lunch with family. It wasn't until my mom got us involved in a church where there started becoming an influx of like Bible talk, religious aspects of Christianity, and that sort of thing.
Let's talk about your experience at the church. Did you connect to it, and what sort of aspects did you like most, or which parts did you perhaps not like as much?
So I connected to the community and the family aspect. The church that I was brought into was something called a denomination of the Free Holiness Mission Church, and it was started by a family. The patriarch of the family was the pastor, and my mom, as a single mom, very, very much struggled to make ends meet, and any help or any sort of community that she could give us was very important and vital for her. And during the first year being there, I remember having very happy memories of joining the Saturday night suppers or the Sunday night suppers, or sometimes they would do Christmas parties, Easter get-togethers. So that was the most exciting aspect of the community there.
Did you take any religious practices home, or was your Christianity something you just participated in through the church?
It was very much fragmented. Once we kept going and my mom felt like we understood what she was trying to achieve or what she was trying to introduce us to, my brother and I remember coming home and she's like, okay, we're going to pray before supper. And I was like, what? and because at that point, it was very much on Sunday, you're religious. On Sunday, you go to church, you do Bible study, and then you come home. And when you come home, it's like you kind of forget all of that stuff, at the church. And that is something that I think was one of the first flags that I had a problem with. It didn't make sense to me, even as a young child at 12 years old, it didn't make sense to me that I was religious only one day during the week, and then the rest of the week, it didn't come into every aspect of my life.
Let's talk about your level of exposure to the idea of Judaism and Jews. Growing up in a small town, did you have any knowledge of what a Jew looked like or what Judaism meant?
None at all. Now, obviously, with snowbirds moving down to Wilmington, North Carolina, it's a very popular place for older people to come and settle in their retirement age. There's a heavier Jewish population there. Where I was raised in Jacksonville, which is an offset of Camp Lejeune, there were no outwardly Jewish people. My concept of what a Jewish person was actually what I read in Holocaust books. So when I was 9 years old, my stepmother is very much into World War II and the Holocaust. She actually introduced me to Primo Levi's Survival in Auschwitz. And when I was 9 years old, I read it for the first time. And my concept of the Jewish people were a people that were very, very great and then unfortunately persecuted. But I was too young to understand why. And I think many people now are still asking why. But as a 9-year-old, 10-year-old at that time, I felt very much upset because I felt connected to this people. But at the same time, I was so confused because how am I connected to the Jewish people? I'm not a Jew, but I felt like I was. And I had no one that I could talk to about this. There was no rabbi. There were no people that I felt safe with to speak to at my church where I could ask them, I feel like I'm connected to the Jewish people and feel like I would be honored and valued and answered seriously.
So would you say that your knowledge of the Holocaust was your sort of entry point to learning more about Judaism and Jews?
I would say it was the starting point because it got me learning about how the Jewish people are different, but through the lens of the final solution and Germany and Holocaust. So it was a very, I don't want to say negative intro, but it was not a positive intro in the sense of these people are full of life and they have the Torah and they have Hasidus and they have incredible holidays.
If your first exposure to Judaism was associated with the Jews being different and singled out for that difference and persecuted because of that difference, why then the further interest, or why then the connection to such a people? Why would you want to be associated or explore more such a nation?
So there are two things that come to mind. One is I felt an indescribable magnetic pull within me that made me feel like this is where I was ultimately going to end up. Interestingly enough, on Facebook, in one of the months, it does like this time 10 years ago, right? In high school, if you count back the years, I was 16 at the time. And I was having a conversation with a couple of girlfriends. And we were talking about what we wanted to be when we grew up. And one was like, I want to be a dentist. The other's like, I want to be a softball coach. The other one, and then I say, I want to be a Jew. Why I felt compulsed to put that on Facebook, I don't know. That's another question for a different day.
When you were exploring your Judaism more through Holocaust stories, etc., you mentioned you were 9 years old at this point and you had lots of questions, but no one to ask them to. Do you remember any of the specific questions you had or what thoughts or feelings it brought up in you? And if you did ask anyone these questions, what sort of guidance or answers were you getting, if any?
So the only person I had to ask questions to was my stepmother, who has done a lot of reading and educating herself in the Holocaust, World War II. It's a hobby of hers, I guess, if you could say. She thoroughly enjoys military history. And I would ask her, why is this why did this happen? And she only had technical answers for me in the sense of, well, Germany felt as if what happened after World War I was unfair. And so that's how Hitler came to power. Answers such as that. Nothing that addressed the spiritual questions, which left me with an even deeper feeling, because now looking back, I realized that the questions and the void I was trying to fill was a spiritual void. But no one was in my life who could help me fill that spiritual void. And I also didn't feel comfortable really exposing a part of myself to anyone because I didn't even know what I felt myself.
Did you ever think to turn to any leaders at church with such questions?
I did turn to them, but only from a Christian standpoint. Like, how do we know that Yashka is the Messiah? How do we know that this Bible is the true Bible? I had questions such as that. And the answers that I was given were, well, because we're told that this is so, or because this is what we have, so we know it's true. And at 12, 13 years old, I kind of laughed because I was like, but how? And it was a very naive question. But unfortunately, certain people in the church, certain Sunday school teachers and whatnot, because they didn't have an answer to give me, they wanted to have an answer, just a one-stop fix answer, and they didn't have that. And so since they didn't have that, they weren't comfortable with saying, I don't know. And so they came up with an answer that they thought would pacify me. And then when I came back with more questions, it was like aggravating because they just wanted to squash the whole conversation altogether. And that wasn't good enough for me.
After these sort of interactions where you weren't getting satisfactory answers with your spiritual questions, did you keep going back to church or keep looking into Christianity for more? Or was there ever a point where you thought, I've explored this until the end and there's not much more I can find here?
I'll have to say one of the big turning points was we had this person who would come to church and they said that he could speak in tongues. And they claim that certain people are prophets and they can speak in tongues, which is to this church a very holy language and a sign that someone has the Holy Spirit upon them. And I remember being very scared when this person would ever come into church. He would come randomly. No one knew when he was showing up, but he would come in randomly. And when he did, it was a whole crazy spectacle. He would be talking gibberish. I called it gibberish at the time. Everyone was like, he's talking so holy, but he was talking gibberish. And he was very scary to me because he seemed out of control. It was only later that I realized and found out from other people that he was actually a crack addict going through withdrawals. And at that point, I was like, this is not what I want for my future. And he was someone who the church welcomed him in. They never turned anyone away. And so it wasn't like they could prevent him from coming. It would go against their beliefs, which that church held true to. Not every church does, but that church was accepting of anyone who came. So he would claim that he could come in and speak tongues. And I remember there was one particular day where it was very just emotionally disturbing. And I caused a fight purposefully with my mother saying, I'm never coming to this church again. This is crazy. No. And she kept asking me, or she kept telling me, you are in my household, you're coming to church. You are in my household, you're coming to church. There was nothing of like, I understand how you're feeling. I understand why you feel this way. You live with me. You're coming to church. It's good for you. I want you to be raised in a religion. You're coming. And now looking back as a mother myself, I see her only way to give me a connection to God was that way. And I'm very grateful to her for that. I don't want it to come across as negative in any way. But it wasn't a way for me to connect because it didn't feel true for me. In order to keep a peaceful home, I had to go to church on Sundays, but I wasn't required to participate. So I would go, I would sit in the pews, I wouldn't sing, I wouldn't do anything. I would basically turn off for 2 hours every Sunday. It was my dreaming time. And then we would go home, we would have lunch, and it would be a restful Sunday. It wasn't until I went to university at 18 and I moved out of my house that I shunned off religion altogether because the only way that was given to me was a way that I didn't connect. And through that process, I built up a lot of frustration towards God, but also towards family members for putting me in a situation I felt like didn't serve me or help me at all.
So at this point, university age, you said you were turned off by religion. So how then did you move into a space where you were, more curious about Judaism, because it sounded like you had a negative experience with religion and it felt sort of imposed on you. So then what caused that turnaround?
I was a Bachelor's of Arts major. I have 2 degrees, one in German languages and literatures, the other in political science. And I had to take an intro to religions course, part of the prerequisites for humanities and a bachelor's of arts. So part of that class was going to a place of different worship and writing a paper on it, essentially on your experience. And in the university town that I went to, there was a reform/conservative synagogue. There was a mosque, there was a Buddhist temple, and then obviously churches. But because I grew up in a church, I couldn't go there. So I decided to go to the synagogue.
And how was your first experience at the synagogue?
So it was interesting because I remember it was Passover, and it was it's a very small group because most people were away for the holiday or didn't come. And I remember not being able to understand anything. They were singing, they passed out like English transliterated, I don't want to say brochures, but I guess like songbooks. And I remember thinking, I feel at home, but at the same time, I don't know anything that's happening. Let's just figure it out.
That's interesting that you felt at home in such a foreign place. I assume you'd never been to a synagogue before
No.
then. What do you think made you feel at home?
Being in a place where I felt connected to a people that I already felt a connection to helped. As I continued to attend and sort of become a part of the community, then I felt like I was tapping into that hidden part of me. Sounds strange explaining it because it felt so natural. But at the same time, I wasn't Jewish, so I was still an outsider, and that had to be addressed. So I remember going to the rabbi, a female rabbi at the time, and I asked her, I said, I feel like I'm supposed to belong to this people, but I'm not. And she goes, okay, so what are you thinking about doing? And I was like, well, I'd like to convert. And at that point, that was my only exposure to Judaism. I saw through like Sex and the City, for example, videos of like Hasidic Jews or like Orthodox Jews. Charlotte herself went on a conversion path. So that was my like multimedia exposure besides Schindler's List and The Pianist, Holocaust aspect. And I thought that what I was pursuing was based on Torah and based on what Hashem said at Mount Sinai, what God said at Mount Sinai. And I remember she pushed me off for a couple of times that summer, as is customary. And then finally we agreed to meet, and she actually showed up. And we started having a conversation and what that would look like. And that path would essentially be for a year, reading a book or two each month, meeting with her once a month, discussing what I learned, how it would impact my life, how it would change my life. And at the end, it would ultimately culminate in going to a kosher mikvah.
How was your experience of the conversion? Was Judaism what you expected? Did you have a couple surprises?
I would say what surprised me when we got to the topic of koshers was learning that milk and meat shouldn't be separate, learning that shellfish and insects were prohibited. But then going home and saying, okay, I'm keeping kosher, but none of my kalim, none of my vessels or utensils were immersed in a mikvah. I still ate shrimp. I enjoyed cheeseburgers. But then at a certain point, I became a vegetarian. So I was like, that solves everything. I've got it figured out. But I would still have shrimp. And I realized at the time going through, there was a little bit of a disconnect. And when I approached the congregation or my friends in the congregation, the rabbi, it was mostly like, this is what you're supposed to do. It's up to you if you do it, which is a very Jewish answer. And I remember thinking, okay, it's a choice. And I remember thinking, for right now, I'm in a student apartment with people who aren't Jewish, even though I'm on my path to becoming Jewish as I thought I was. For me, it was mostly a thing of, well, when I get to my own house with my own family, I'll start keeping it this way. And it didn't click in my mind that already there was a disconnect. But I was so thirsty for some sort of religion, some sort of connection to God, and I felt like I found it in this conservative reform shul that I went to, that it didn't matter, because I knew eventually one day I would have what I was supposed to have. And what I was supposed to have would be a beautiful Jewish family, keeping kosher, maybe even Shabbat.
Were there any Jewish teachings or values or ideas that drew you in beyond the practical application?
That what attracted me to Judaism was being called up to the Torah, which I've been called up to twice, interestingly enough. But in the sense of that there is a book that's read throughout the entire year, and then when you get to the end of the year, you start again. And so through that, I already saw that if you learned something one year, it might be expounded upon in the next year, but then you might learn something completely different in the following year. So the emphasis and value placed on education was something that spoke very highly to me, because growing up, I didn't grow up in an educated religious environment. Someone decided that they wanted to start a church. So then they bought literature from a place that they felt would be good for their church, and then it was taken from there. There was no formal education that was provided to any of the Sunday school teachers or to any of the community leaders. It was mostly self-taught and self-led, whereas in Judaism, we're also self-taught and self-led, but there's also an emphasis on higher learning and a value put to that. So that was something that spoke to me and my practical side as well as my emotional side.
You mentioned earlier you experienced a bit of a disconnect in your initial experience of Judaism. How did you go about navigating that and eventually, I assume, solving that disconnect?
Eventually, I went through with my conservative conversion, and I sat through the formal Beis-Din process and went to a conservative mikvah to immerse, and was given a certificate, which interestingly enough, I still have to this day. Just it's like a memento of that part of my life. And at that point, I felt I had achieved what I had set out to do. I was Jewish. I could keep kosher. I could keep my version of kosher. I could light Shabbos candles. And I was also very involved in making challah for Kabbalat Shabbat services on Friday night. At that point, I moved to Germany and lived in a city called Cologne, Köln, for those who speak German or Yiddish. And there was an Orthodox synagogue that was about 10-minute walk from the apartment that I lived at. And I went one Shabbos day, and tried to go in. Well, if you go to any shul, any synagogue in Germany, you have to register beforehand for security purposes, and you have to present ID, and it has to be a pre-approved process before. I didn't know this. I'm the American that's coming in from, you can walk into anywhere you go and you're accepted, and it's great to have you here. Amazing. Thank you for coming. So when I arrived at the synagogue, I was like, I'm here for services. And they go, okay, did you tell us that you were coming before? I said, no. And at this point, I was caught off a little bit by the coldness, because I was very much convicted in my sense of, I'm Jewish and I'm a Jewish woman. I'm trying to come to synagogue. And I was told, well, and I was explaining to them, yeah, I just converted. And they go, oh, how? They ask questions. And at the time, I thought, oh, interesting. They're very much focused on my journey and kind of why I've ended up here. Now looking back, I realized totally they were screening me and vetting me through their own security process. And they're like, where did you convert? And I say, well, in North Carolina. What synagogue? Oh, it's the shul called Congregation Beth Shalom. It's a conservative reform synagogue. And they go, okay, we see. We're sorry to tell you, but you're not Jewish. And unfortunately, we can't let you in today. At another time, we would be able to let you in once we go through a security process. And I was very taken aback because already I had a little preconceived notion of what Orthodoxy was, in the sense of they didn't accept anyone unless they had an Orthodox conversion. And that was actually spoken about through my conservative process. But it was approached in the way of, well, if they don't accept you, then you don't want to be a part of them anyways. And at the time it worked because I didn't really see that I was going to overhaul my life and make it into what it is now. But that was the initial shock. And so I said, okay, I'm not accepted at the Orthodox synagogue. I'll see if there's another community that is in the area. And there was a liberal, in Germany, they call their conservative, reform, traditional synagogues liberal communities. So there was one in the area. And I said, great, I'll go there.
Did your experience trying to go into an Orthodox synagogue and them turning you away, did that not turn you off at all?
I'll say yes, it did turn me off. And it was almost in my mind a confirmation of, well, if the Orthodox people aren't going to accept me, then I don't want to be a part of them anyways. So that's what caused me to essentially go to the conservative Jewish community. And once I was there, I felt like I was finally accepted. And so I had that acceptance that I needed, that social acceptance and religious acceptance. And it didn't cause me to search for anything more at that point. I felt accepted, and it was almost as if the orthodoxy part just kind of fell away. Didn't really matter at that point.
So what did cause you to search for a little more eventually?
So I remember it was that Tishrei when I started going to the liberal synagogue, and when throughout the couple of months of attending, I remember it came to be around Hanukkah time, and I felt like this gnawing feeling inside of me. I didn't really enjoy going to the services so much anymore. I was asking questions of certain community members, and they themselves didn't know, which was fine. But I felt like there was more. So but at that time, I wasn't going to go back to the Orthodox synagogue in Cologne. I just wasn't going to do that. So I decided that Passover, that April, I was working for a family in Germany at the time as an au pair, and they had a break. I had a break also. So I decided to go to Antwerp, which has a very huge Hasidic community. And I remember thinking as I booked the ticket, I just want to go and be amongst visibly Jewish people. And so I got there. I arrived at the train station. I remember seeing a Hasidic Jew with a very long payas rushing past me. And I was like, okay, this is what I was looking for. And as I was in the city, I connected with an old university student colleague who also studied with me during my first year in Europe at university in Germany. And he was pursuing a music education at the Antwerp School of Musical Conservatory. We met, caught up, and he goes, "You're Jewish now, right?" And I didn't really know what to answer to him because my answer was going to be very technical, and I knew he wouldn't get it. So I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "Great, amazing. I know someone who grew up Jewish. I don't think they're religious anymore, but I'll put you in contact with him. Maybe he'll introduce you to people." And I said, "Amazing, let's do it." And that's how I met my friend David, who grew up in the Satmar community and then actually left the community to study at the Antwerp music university.
And what did he tell you about Judaism?
So I met my friend David, who grew up Satmar, which is a small, ultra-Orthodox Hasidic branch of Judaism. Very observant, very strict in all of their observances. And for him, that was very constrictive and wasn't something that he wanted to pursue in his adulthood. And he was very confused as to why I would want to become Jewish, because that was all that he knew, and that was something that he was running from. And we met in the middle because he wanted what I had, which was freedom in his eyes, the ability to do whatever I wanted, wear whatever I wanted, study whatever I wanted. And I wanted what he had, which was, from how I saw it, an entry point into a very warm and exciting lifestyle. And God was also there. And we met in the middle. He introduced me to a Chabad couple in Antwerp by the name of Yossi and Chomi Weiss. And I remember having my first ever Shabbos meal Friday night there. I lit candles. We walked to their house, did the traditional shouting up to the window so the child would throw down the key in a oven mitt and then opening up the door. I thought this was all fascinating and really cool. And when I was there, we were exchanging pleasantries. The Weisses were known for always having very interesting people at their Shabbos tables. And they did a lot of reaching out to the people who grew up in the Satmar or Ger or Belz communities, but at some point decided that they didn't want to be a part of those communities any longer, but still wanted to have some sort of semblance to Yiddishkeit, to being Jewish, and would go to them to have Shabbos meals. And the Rebbitzin, Alav Shalom, she pulled me aside, and I remember very vividly her asking me, "What am I doing there?" I said, "I'm here for a Shabbat meal." And she goes, "No, I don't mean that. We're happy to have you here. What are you doing in Germany?" I said, "Well, I'm pursuing my dream of always living in Europe." And she goes, "Why? Why do you want to be in Europe? You don't belong in Europe." And at this point, the thoughts going through my head were like, whoa, who is this person? I'm pursuing a life dream of mine, and she's never met me before. She doesn't know what I've gone through, doesn't know anything, and she's telling me that I don't belong here, which was true. But at the point, I was very stubborn in my conviction of I needed to be in Germany. And she told me, I grew up in Crown Heights in Brooklyn, in an incredible community, incredible place. I can't wait to go back there. But my husband and I are here on a shulchus, and we're here on a mission that the Rebbe gave to us. And we're here for a purpose, and that's to help others connect to Judaism. Why you're in Germany doesn't make sense. You're there because you want to? No. Your purpose isn't there. And at the time, I felt very taken aback. And when I speak to her friends now, they're like, whoa, that doesn't sound like her at all. But she knew what my neshama, like what my soul needed to hear. And she was the ultimate trigger point for that, and was what caused a catalyst of events to follow after, which put me here in Brooklyn.
What would you say were the next steps in your journey after meeting this Chabad woman and her triggering this thought process to maybe explore the option of no longer living in Germany and pursuing your life stream?
So after that trip, I went back to Cologne, and any single free opportunity I had, I found myself going back to Antwerpen. It was an hour by high-speed train, and I had friends that I knew there, obviously, people that I knew there. And I remember one of those times coming back in, I think, May or June. Can't remember the exact month. I remember seeing an advertisement for a birthright trip. And it just so happened that my summer break from my family of being an au pair also coincided with one of the birthright trips. So I went after I think it was after Tisha B'Av that year, or coincided directly with Menachem Av. And I went to Israel on birthright and extended my trip by 4 days. So I was in Israel for a total of 2 weeks. And when my friend David found out that I was going to Israel, he said, if you're going, I'm also going. And I was like, you're a student. How are you going to afford it? And I remember he said, my parents find out I want to go to Israel, they're going to pay. They want me to come back to Yiddishkeit. So he met up with me in Israel and took me to my first ever full Shabbat experience, which was in Tel Stone, which is a very close-knit community and very, very strong in their observance of Shabbat. So they have an arm, they have a traffic gate that they put up on Shabbos so that no one comes through and drives into the community. I felt like we were transported to another alternate reality. They took in Shabbos early, and I remember vividly after they prayed Kabbalat Shabbat, the sun was setting over the hills of Jerusalem, and I saw all of the men coming back and just being taken away by the beauty of it, of the moment. Seeing so many men, they were singing in the streets, welcoming Shabbos, and coming home to have their Shabbat meals with their family. And I knew at that moment that what I had finally been searching for was found, and that I had finally found truth. Now, my question was how to get to that truth. So it became very apparent after that trip that I needed to leave Germany. I couldn't stay in Germany because the conversion process would have been way too difficult in a foreign language, also at a foreign country with visas and everything. So I moved back to North Carolina with my parents, and while I was applying for jobs, I came in contact with the Chabad in Wilmington, North Carolina, Moshe Yitzhak and Hannah Lieblich, and they allowed me to come on Saturday morning. So I would drive down and I would attend services. Then I would stay for their lunch, and I would end up making Havdalah with them and then driving back after Shabbat Saturday night. And that was my taste and my experience of Shabbat in North Carolina while I was waiting to figure out what community I was going to. Eventually, I got a job in Brooklyn with a Jewish nonprofit, and at the same time was pursuing an Orthodox conversion with the Rabbinical Council of America.
And would you say once you moved to Brooklyn and you went through your Orthodox conversion that you felt at peace and you had found what you're looking for?
I knew that what I found was what I was looking for, but I want to make very clear that when I first moved to Brooklyn, I didn't come to Crown Heights immediately. And even when I did end up in Crown Heights, I hesitated calling myself Chabad because I knew what calling myself Chabad or affiliating myself with the Chabad movement would mean in the sense of becoming a chassid of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, as I would view myself at that point, was something very serious and shouldn't be taken lightly. So I wanted to be sure entirely that that decision for the rest of my life would be something that I felt was for me and felt at peace. And I remember that Shavuos, so after I moved to Brooklyn, I went to Israel for 2 weeks, and I found myself looking for Chalav Yisrael products. And I stopped and I asked myself, I said, why is this important to me? And I realized and I learned how Chalav Yisrael is a very specific minhag of Chabad. And I found myself asking, do I feel connected to it? Is it something that was put upon me because of the apartment I was living in? Was it something that was put upon me because of the community? Where was it coming from? And I realized that it tied back into my learning and exposure in Crown Heights, and that it was something I wanted to keep. And ultimately, through that soul searching and then spending even more time in Crown Heights, I realized that there was a connection to the Rebbe and to the Chabad movement, and that I was finally where I was supposed to be.
You mentioned earlier that there was some difference of opinion between you and your mother when you started asking more questions about Judaism and going to church. How did that change over time?
Yeah. So with my family, it was something that I didn't really include them in. Like my journey to Judaism, I didn't really keep them involved. It was just kind of like, this is what I'm doing. And the reason why was because I didn't know how to bridge that gap. Because I myself didn't really know in the beginning what I was presenting to them. When I did my conservative conversion, I didn't learn enough as I felt to be able to show them the beauty and the what really drew me to Judaism. I would say everything came to a head when I got engaged, and as things happen when they're not really appropriately addressed, they sort of bubble up and come to a head. So when my husband and I got engaged, we were making the wedding invitations, and I remember having a conversation with my mom saying, the wedding invitations are going to have my Hebrew name on it. And she goes, you're not going to make any with your English name? And I said, no, this is who I am. And we're sending these to a lot of people in the community. And at that point, I had tried multiple times to sort of get her to come around and see and whatnot. But it was something that she had to come to terms with on her own. And then once that happened, then we could sort of move forward mutually. So I remember that being the breaking point in the sense of she realized that this wasn't a fad, it was for good. And while the English name that she gave me is always going to be a part of me and a part of who I am now is also a new person and is also connected to that little girl that she raised. Once we had that conversation, once my husband and I got married, and then Baruch Hashem, thank God we welcomed a baby boy, that helped really to smooth over any sort of complications that maybe would have been there, because she saw how happy I was. She saw how I have a beautiful family. She wants to be a part of that. And although she doesn't understand it and it's not something that speaks to her, she realized very quickly that if she wanted to be a part and be involved, then she would have to come to terms with it on her own. And she did.
Do you have a message that you'd like to share?
My key takeaway from my whole journey is that no one has to be perfect. So a teaching that I grew up with in the Christianity faith was that we were sent here and we're not perfect. We should be striving for perfection. And we're here, we don't know why. That's how it was presented to me and what I took away from it. And something that I learned through going to seminary, listening to classes by rabbis, is that we aren't perfect, but God wants us anyways. And we're here to make this into a place where He wants to be. And that is something that really I think everyone is looking for. They want to know that no one is perfect. And while we have those tendencies to want to be like the most perfect person and the best and, 100% on everything, we aren't angels. And we are here for a mission. And part of that mission can be pretty messy sometimes and can be pretty imperfect. But that's okay. And that's precisely why God wants us to be here.